like a plan.
All right. And now you're being recorded as well, so.
Always good for the heads up.
Oh, everyone. Hello, hello. We're gonna get started here in a few minutes. We see people filling the room now, and so we're just giving a couple more minutes for everybody to be situated. But thank you so much for being here today. We will get started in about a minute here. In the meantime, just a very useful public service announcement. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function. We really hope that this panel discussion can be interactive. And so if any of you have any questions, I know we've been living in the Zoom era for long enough that you're all probably familiar with it, but feel free to write the questions down in the Q&A. And we will make sure to address them as we go. And so it is my pleasure to start off today's panel. Just by way of introduction, many of you probably were aware that in October we did a multi-school coalition of Indiana schools for cybersecurity, right? With the express intent of helping us all as universities and academic institutions to work together to build up our cyber sort of stature across the state. And at the end of that event, that very excellent event, we all pledged that we would make conscious efforts, right, to continue to work together and collaborate. And this event is in many ways one of the early fruits of that collaboration. And so we're really looking forward today to be speaking about the ethical elements of cybersecurity. We're joined today by a wonderful panel from representing all of our universities, and I have the pleasure of introducing them. After I introduce them, they'll each have a few moments just to give a sort of opening statement, as it were, just some thoughts maybe about their own work, how this relates to the broader topic, and then we have a series of questions and that will sort of set our discussion moving forward. And so I'm joined today by Professor Marc Bourgeois, who is a professor of practice at Notre Dame's Technology and Ethics Center. I'm also joined by Clovia Hamilton, who's currently an assistant professor of technology and society at SUNY in Korea, but will be joining the Kelly faculty at Indiana University here in the summer. And we are so glad to be welcoming you to the Indiana family and to the IU faculty as well. I'm joined by Scott Shackelford, who's an associate professor of business law and ethics at the Kelly School of Business at Indiana University. He's also the cybersecurity and risk management program chair and the executive director of the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University Bloomington, amongst other things. And then finally, we're joined, or will be joined very shortly, by Gene Spafford. Spaff is a professor of computer science at Purdue and the former executive director of Purdue's Sirius. And so with that, I'm going to let each of you give, a short, sort of, opening statement, and I will start with you, Marc.
Okay, well, thank you. It's great to be on this illustrious panel. I want to, just as a quick overview of myself and my work, I want to be transparent that I don't do a lot of work specifically in cybersecurity, but I do a lot of work around the concept of responsibility in technology ethics and in innovation generally. So I thought it might be useful if I just review 2 or 3 of the bigger projects that I tend to work on. The first is around technology ethics education, which is an area we're trying to invest a lot in. We think it's really important that as engineers and other innovators get their technical foundations, they also come into their work with a strong sense of ethics and purpose and responsibility. So I teach a course called Technology, Ethics, and Innovation. It's for our Silicon Valley program. We send students out to Silicon Valley every semester. They do internships in big tech companies. And the course is partly just your sort of standard tech ethics topics, but it's also heavily focused on the responsibilities of innovators and what innovation means, which is something I hope to refer back to soon. My other big project is with our Tech Transfer Center. I have an NSF C-STEM award for responsible innovation. And so I'm doing a graduate student and law student training program in responsible innovation, where these students from all different disciplines across campus, all different schools, in fact, across campus, come together in a cohort to study technology ethics, to study responsible innovation, and then to analyze as consultants technology that is undergoing commercialization in our own Tech Transfer Center, which we call the Idea Center. And also associated with that project, I do some consulting with the Idea Center to try to gradually seed our processes and our culture with the principles of responsible innovation, which is something I can talk more about later as well. So that's my background, and that's the perspective I'm approaching these cybersecurity responsibility issues from.
Thank you, Mark. Clovia, open statements.
Okay. I've taught business law and ethics for about 10 years. And I started working in the academy on a research administration side. So I started as a patent attorney managing patents for the University of Illinois in Champaign. And I went on to do it for Old Dominion University. And so a lot of my research is focused, as with Mark, is focused on technology transfer. But recently, I want to say maybe a couple of years ago, I did a co-authored publication where my co-author is a professor of computer science at Winthrop University, Dr. Garrison, and she had been studying data privacy. And so we did a comparative analysis of US data privacy laws compared to the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. So that was actually my first data privacy paper. And then this year, I have a paper that came out where we focused on the use of devices like Alexa and the data privacy issues related to that. So, I want to do more in the cybersecurity space and data privacy space, but I'm the newbie of the bunch. I'm an emerging scholar. I only have 2 publications so far. So I can certainly share some of the information that I've gleaned when working on those 2 studies. So.
Thank you so much. And Scott?
Absolutely. Hello, everybody. And thank you for spending some time with us at the end of a very busy term, especially on a Friday afternoon Eastern. So we really appreciate that. And thanks, Isak, for moderating this wonderful discussion. And I do hope that Spaff will join us soon. I think he will. So, for this particular topic, despite the fact of being an associate professor of business law and ethics, I don't have any formal training in ethics. And I really hadn't even been teaching ethics until, just being thrown in the deep end, basically. So I had to kind of learn it, frankly, on the fly, which I'm sorry to say, because I wish I had a much deeper grounding. I have been teaching cybersecurity ethics in my cyber law and policy courses over the years, but usually it was just relegated, unfortunately, to 1 or 2 sessions. Usually we've been talking about things in class like how we think about coding ethics in the IoT context, using, for example, MIT's Moral Machine experiment as a lens. And that's a kind of an effort to crowdsource some of these tough decisions that autonomous vehicles have to make, in real time about whether to swerve or not, whether to protect the inhabitants of a vehicle or not, kind of the 21st century version of the trolley problem you're probably familiar with. So I'm interested in those types of issues. I did do a book on the Internet of Things last year, just for a just for a popular audience. So I'd love to talk about some of those issues. On the norm building side, I'm really interested because my background is as a PhD in international relations, as well as a law degree. So I'm really keen on exploring some international norm building efforts around what we call cyber peace. And we do have a working group on cyber peace at the Ostrom workshop for anybody who might be interested. And we're looking in particular at what it means, right? Both from a classic, more multilateral norm building perspective and more of a multi-stakeholder perspective for how we reach a common ground about what a global culture of cybersecurity looks like, right? What should the responsibilities be of companies and countries, and that really the rubber meets the road in issues like cybersecurity due diligence there, for example. So I'd love to talk more about that. We do have an edited volume coming out on cyber peace that I'm co-editing with Frédéric Duzet from Paris 8 University and Chris Ankerson from NYU this coming spring. So we'll be having some events around that. But it's just a first stab, right? It's a new field, cyber peace studies, and would love to engage with any of you who might be interested. And lastly, I'll just note one thing that happened earlier this year that really got me keen to explore this area in more depth, which is why I'm so glad that we had to have the opportunity here to get so many folks on the line, is some of the ransomware attacks that we saw on critical infrastructure providers, including Colonial Pipeline. And you might remember at that point earlier this year, their CEO, Joseph Blunt, got a lot of heat for paying $4.4 million to DarkSide, this Russia-based hacking group. And he defended his decision in Congress by saying it was the right thing to do for the country. So we talk about that a lot in class. Is paying a ransom ever the right thing to do using different ethical lenses? And that's one of those debates that I would love to continue to have on this panel, because obviously reasonable people can disagree on that. So thank you so much again for the opportunity. I would love to have a great discussion to follow here.
Well, so let's build off of that very last point. The first point that you made, rather, about responsibility. And in many ways, we're innovating faster than we can secure. So in your mind, Scott, and then I'd love to hear from everybody else, where does this sort of responsibility for securing our increasingly interconnected world rest?
It's really the fundamental question, right, Isak? And in some ways, it's everybody's responsibility. But then the classic rejoinder, well, if it's all of our responsibilities, is it anybody's, responsibility at the end of the day? You can make an argument for why companies, just from a purely ethical perspective, leaving the law to one side, should be doing a better job at protecting their consumers' information, as well as their employees' information for that matter, right? And there's a movement around ESG plus T, so kind of the idea of how we operationalize sustainability, add in the technology element to help make that happen. And there's some tools like sustainability reports, these GRI frameworks that can be useful for companies and decision makers on boards to get a better sense for not only environmental, the social, the governance impacts of their operations, but also their impacts on the broader technology ecosystem. And there's some companies like Eli Lilly, for example, that now talk about their internet connected insulin pumps as part of their sustainability report, which is kind of interesting. So I do think the private sector has a central role to play here, right? I mean, they're the driving force behind a lot of this innovation. The internet would not exist in the form that we have it today, without it. And depending on the vantage point that we'd like to dive into and the particular issue area, including content moderation, my goodness, there's a lot of layers of responsibility that we've affirmatively placed on companies to figure out some of these really hard topics for themselves. Having said that, clearly government has a role to play here. And there's a lot of wonderful debates that we can get into about, are we witnessing or not? Well, first, should cybersecurity be considered a classic public good, like national security, right? Well, if that's the case, the private sector is not that great at producing public goods the way they are private goods. If it's a public good, clearly, like education, national security, a healthy environment, the government should have a bigger role to play. What form should that take, right? And where are some of those dividing lines between, for example, the Department of Defense and Cyber Command versus the Department of Homeland Security and protecting our critical infrastructure, such as, Colonial Pipeline in that case, or hospitals, you name the other critical infrastructure provider. So governments clearly have a role to play. I think there's been more of a wake-up call in the last few years in Congress, but in the states too, which we can talk more about, with a lot of states passing different kinds of cybersecurity laws, from some that are defining reasonable cybersecurity for the first time, like California, for example. If you want to sell an internet connected device, it has to demonstrate reasonable cybersecurity, and that's defined in large part through the CIS, top 20. Whereas other states like Ohio have this safe harbor approach, where they basically have a menu of options that companies can invest in, and they use that then as an affirmative defense if they're breached. And that's kind of the carrot to go along with the stick. So it is both, in my mind. It is both, and that's why I think these multi-stakeholder dialogues, domestically, internationally, are so vital in moving the ball forward. But at the same time, as we know through the Ostrom workshops. Sorry, internet connection issue.
Excellent. Well,
sorry about that. Please, yeah, feel free to go to the next person.
Well, so,
I was going to wind up by saying, with the Ostrom's tradition, you can't have much coordination without that communication, and without coordination and communication, you can't build trust. So I was just going to wind up with that. So I'm sorry for the internet.
Which I think is a point we should come back to in a second. But I'd love to hear from Clovia. What are your thoughts on this question about responsibility and where that lays and what we should do about it?
I think it's a great question. What came to mind thinking of it is who are our stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders involved in all of this? And so I made a list. We have end users who are stakeholders, the folks who use the internet, use these applications, use these devices that are connected to the internet and that sort of thing. You got government, as Scott mentioned, the government clearly has a role to play in this. I think the European Union has a gold standard with the GDPR. I would like to see more countries adopt regulations like that. So I can talk a little bit about that. Then we have the designers of these applications, the folks who actually develop these technologies, what are their responsibilities? The companies that sell software applications and sell computer devices, they have responsibility. So it's sort of a shared value or shared responsibility problem. And then you also have the social media platforms, which have been in the news quite a bit here recently, especially with Facebook and that sort of thing. So I took some notes. I'll try to go through them pretty quickly. Some ideas that I have about what these different stakeholders' responsibilities might look like, what they might be. With end users, they need to be responsible for what they actually share online in terms of their data that they want to be secured. So, being responsible for what they post online and share and enter in terms of data entry. Users can also be proactively involved with demanding that companies address data breaches. If there's a data breach, you might see on social media platforms, people complain that they're concerned, but how far do they really go? Do they go and contact their legislators and that sort of thing? Do they contact these companies and voice their concerns? So, that's a role that the end users can play. And the users do not have to use the internet. They don't have to use these devices at all. That's not likely going to happen. I don't think we're going to give up that trade-off and give up technology. We want to see these technological advances, but that is an option. And there are some scholars that advocate that users could take on the stance of walking away from Facebook and walking away from the use of different applications. In terms of government, as I mentioned, I'm kind of a fan of the GDPR. I would like to see more countries take on national federal regulations. In the United States, we don't have that yet. The regulations, as Scott mentioned, for cybersecurity is at the state level for the most part. And that's a problem for companies, because it makes it very hard to implement, comply with regulations when you have to comply with regulations in 50 different states, and they may all be different. They have different definitions and things like that. It's really a problem for small businesses. So I would like to see the United States take on a federal regulation. And there are some countries that are moving in that direction. With the designers, they can implement privacy and security by design. I don't think they're doing a very good job of that. So, we can engineer privacy into our designs, and the designers can also work on privacy, what's called privacy resignation. That's where end users just kind of give up on privacy. In fact, one of my co-authors on the Alexa data privacy paper, he said, Chloe, we just need to give up on privacy. We just give away all of our privacy, and we shouldn't care about data security. And, so of course we don't want, at least I don't want us to move in that direction where we have privacy avoidance or undervalue privacy, marginalize it. I think we need to do something about it, and I think we're capable of doing something about it. And with software vendors, again, I think the United States needs to have data protection laws at a federal level rather than at the state level. And with social media platforms, I think we've learned quite a bit from the whistleblower, Francis Hagen, who's come out and spoke about, what's going on in terms of how lax things are in terms of safeguarding data. Because for example, with Facebook, their algorithm is designed to benefit them if there's engagement. So there's really no motivation to try to reduce hate speech and problems like that are concerning folks. And so Facebook has taken on this, people view it as putting profits before end user safety. So, so I think, social media platforms like Facebook can certainly do more. I think they need to reevaluate their business model. And I don't think they're going to do that until there's, regulation.
This leads to a question that I'd like to ask Mark, something that you brought up at the beginning about your research being interested in sort of the scientific process of innovation, right? And so both Scott and Clovia have pointed out, the multi-stakeholders, all the different people who are involved in the process, right? And so I'd be interested to hear from you some reflections on the ethical concerns surrounding scientific innovation broadly, right? And how those are feeding into our sort of the ethics of cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe I'll start with this, what I see as a sort of dichotomy in the discussion that has sort of popped up between Scott and Clovia, especially between the examples of like the cybersecurity of the pipeline and the example of Facebook. So to me, those are really radically different cases, but they're both instructive in different ways. In the pipeline case, and I think maybe in the sort of traditional cybersecurity perspective, we know what we're trying to prevent, and we all agree on that, right? It was in nobody's interest but the ransomware attackers to breach that system and to extract those payments. And we can all, from a basic kind of, I think, ethical standpoint, look at that and agree on what the correct outcome would be, right? We should prevent that. We should do everything we can to minimize those harms. On the other hand, when you look at something like Facebook, as you pointed out, Clovia, it's not really clear that Facebook has an interest in preventing all the different kinds of harms that you or I or the public in general might be interested in preventing if it would cost them engagement, if it would cost them revenue, if it would come at the price of their bottom line. So I want to always distinguish when we talk about responsibility or ethics or even innovation, I would always want to distinguish between those goods and harms which we can all essentially agree on relatively easily, and those goods and harms which are, if not morally contested, at least not unanimous, or at least sought to the same degree by all parties. So that's just sort of a little bit of maybe a background condition for what I want to say. Because I do want to circle back and focus more on this concept of responsibility, this idea of responsibility. So both of you have already raised a point that I wanted us to eventually bring out, and you brought it out very quickly, which is that these responsibilities are shared. They have to be engaged socially. They don't exist in isolation in any one locale or any one role. At the same time, I do pay special attention to the role of innovators and the responsibilities of innovators, because as some of you implied, it won't do to say that, oh, these responsibilities are all just collective. Right? We all have a piece of responsibility. It's up to the users, they have responsibility. It's up to the government regulators, they have responsibility. And those are true. But I think what that loses sight of is the nature of innovation itself. So in innovation, people are making things happen, right? So some people are doing the research, some people are doing the development, some people are starting companies, some people are selling or investing. And those people, those roles, they really do have special primary responsibility, I would say. But here's maybe the paradox of the dichotomy. Even those people playing those roles cannot exercise those responsibilities individually. They need to be engaged. They need to be in communication with their stakeholders. They need to be soliciting different opinions. And so here's one way I try to think about this, drawing on some of the responsible innovation literature. When you look at the concept of responsibility and its historical meaning, Alexei Grinbaum and his co-author Groves have a really nice paper, What is Responsible About Responsible Innovation? And they do a little bit of an etymological analysis, historical analysis of the word responsibility. And they trace it back to, medieval periods and even earlier, where responsibility had a literal meaning. It was your ability to respond, right? Respond to what? Respond to the role that you occupied, right? So it used to be, when we had a much more hierarchical society, a much more caste-based society, and a lot fewer options for what you wanted to do, right? A lot less scope for personal autonomy. You had your role. Maybe you were a priest, maybe you were a king, maybe you were a peasant, but you knew the role that came with that social status. And your ability to respond, your responsibility, was to play that role. And if you messed up, if you violated some edict, if you lost a battle, whatever, then the authority around you, above you, would call you to respond. Well, that's a retroactive notion of responsibility. It's backwards looking, it's role-based. We don't really do that anymore. And especially when we start moving into high technology, innovation, these sort of nebulous dynamic roles, we especially do not have these well-defined instruction sets of what you are supposed to do, what would constitute responsibility. And so we've really moved, maybe in a sense without noticing it, from a retroactive role-based responsibility concept to a forward-looking, proactive responsibility concept. And that is way harder because we do not know really what is expected of us. What we do know is that we're going to be held accountable or responsible at some level, maybe not legally, maybe not professionally, but at some moral level for the effects of our actions. right? So let's say I'm an engineer or coder at Tesla, right? And let's say the algorithm that I coded and that goes out into millions of cars that are on the road, self-driving algorithm, it fails to pick up a pedestrian under some circumstance, right? And someone is struck and someone is killed in a preventable accident because of a flaw in my code that I created as an innovator. Well, I bear responsibility for that, right? And again, it may not be a legal responsibility. It may not be negligence. It is probably not a role-based violation, right? I probably did the best that I could. And at no point was anybody giving me instructions about how to code that algorithm, right? I'm not just a functionary, I'm creating something new. And even if I'm doing the best that I can, at the end of the day, I bear responsibility for the effect of what I create. Or at least morally, we would like to think that I should, and that innovators do. And so that's kind of the paradox, right? We don't have a firm standard for what responsibility consists in. But when something goes wrong, we still want to be able to hold people responsible. And it's clear, at least at a causal sense, maybe morally it's a little murkier, but in a causal sense, that my work created this outcome, right? And of course, that's not the only outcome that it created. It helped people get around, it operated safely in millions of other cases. We don't want all of that good to be washed away by one accident, but nonetheless, there is a deeper moral responsibility there. And of course, that's just one small example. You could say the same thing about Facebook's algorithms and the social disruptions that they have caused at a very large scale. So all of this is just to say that when we talk about responsibility, it's a kind of more nebulous concept than we might think. If I can go on, we see the same kind of thing around innovation, right? So we tend to think of innovation as a concrete thing. We tend to think of it as a technical product, right? This phone is innovative, this algorithm is innovative. But another way to think about innovation, which I find way more productive from a responsibility standpoint or a moral standpoint, is to think of innovation as the future that the introduction of that novelty creates, right? So if you think of like kind of a timeline, right? Kind of like, you know, different choices leading to different timelines, kind of a quantum, if you like. When we introduce an innovation, we're introducing a new timeline. We're introducing a new future. The world with Facebook is a different world now than it was before. And so when we think about responsibility, I think we want to think about responsibility for that future which was nurtured and introduced by innovators primarily, in collaboration with others, but initiated, causally produced by innovators.
Right.
And I think when you put those two ideas together, the idea of responsibility as being proactive, forward-looking, and innovation as being future-creating, what you end up seeing is that it's responsibility for the future that innovators really bear. And so thinking about this now from cybersecurity and trying to sort of import these ideas into that realm, I think we want to think about cybersecurity responsibility in a similar way, which is to say, it's not just about like hardening your system and having good technical standards and debugging the code. It's about thinking, what kind of future am I introducing with this technology? And what kind of harms may I be putting on the table by increasing an attack surface, by introducing new vulnerabilities, by introducing new dependencies? And I think we really want to think about this in a socially embedded, contextual way, so that the people responsible for security are not just thinking about it in terms of standards and reliability and technical competence, but thinking about it in terms of what are the social costs? What are the social risks that I'm introducing? And then it's fairly obvious, I think, we're sort of back to the stakeholder model, because those security professionals, well, to adequately get their hands around the social context, they can't stay just in front of their console. They need to be talking to people. They need to be engaged in the user environment, in the regulatory context, in what competitors are doing. And they need to plan for things like worst case scenarios, backup plans, fail safes, right? It becomes this whole sort of social system that we hope these, I think, security professionals are thinking about, and not just, am I complying with the latest standard? Am I updating all the patches? Am I, doing everything that my procedures tell me I should be doing?
Right.
So, I don't know. I hope that wasn't too much, but that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming at this all from.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. And so building off of that, on the last point, Scott, we started to talk about these sort of trade-offs, right? That we need to be thinking about, when we're both innovating and creating new technologies, but then also when we're thinking about our sort of cybersecurity approaches, right? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about, I guess, perhaps the tensions between cybersecurity and maybe other sort of fundamental rights, things like freedom or privacy, right? And I think there's been this sort of argument at times that an overemphasis of cybersecurity could lead to, for example, to a violation of things like freedom or privacy, or likewise these arguments that we have around, government access to, back channels with, encrypted, end-to-end encrypted communications and such things. Broad question, but would love to hear your reflections on it.
Yeah, what a softball. Certainly, my goodness. Well, I mean, there's no privacy without security. And you're right to point to the fact that the two concepts are in some ways two sides of the same coin. I mean, we're talking about data governance more broadly, really, right? And cybersecurity and privacy are just different aspects or kind of ways to think about that process, as well as different end goals. And there's really legitimate questions about, what the possibilities are. We're never going to get to 100% cybersecurity, just like we're never going to, or never really attain, right, 100% privacy. The definition of privacy itself is changing. I'm remembering back to the famous privacy as the right to be left alone conception from 1890. And with our hyper-connected ecosystem these days, I think there's legitimate questions about what form that takes, right? I'm not in the camp that's incredibly pessimistic that it's just impossible, but it's certainly a lot harder, right, than it used to be. And we do see that playing out with a lot of tensions in organizations. And as you pointed out, Isak, even in nations, in organizations, we see tensions, for example, usually between like the chief privacy officer, the chief information officer, and the chief information security officer, right? I mean, there's a big drive to get new products out quickly. And the mentality, like, for example, in Silicon Valley for a long time was, get it out there and we'll patch it later, right? And that led to this legacy of technical debt that we're all still living with. And just like any debt, it has to be paid back, which is, requires, as Clovia was talking about, as Mark was talking about, a different conception about what that responsibility is in that organization, how it rests and how it continues over time. Because, cybersecurity as an exercise in risk management is not easy. This is a big ecosystem. The timelines can stretch out for months, years, many years, if we're dealing with information that's breached, such as personal health information that just doesn't change. So I think there's a lot of good and necessary work that needs to be done around that intersection of corporate governance and ethics. And then at the national level, you are right that we're seeing some democracies, even some members of the Five Eyes like Australia, which are now mandating access. Backdoor access in encrypted systems, right? We're an intelligence sharing partner with them. So even though we haven't pulled that trigger here in the US, the fact that Australia has, and we have access to all the intelligence Australia is collecting, that is, a point of concern. And then lastly, I'll just note one other, I'm not going to solve any of this, I'm just going to point out problems, there's this vulnerabilities equities process, or VEP, that we're pretty public about here in the US. Very few other countries are. The Netherlands is one other. But this is the process by which a government, including ours, decides when to withhold the vulnerabilities that we find out about, that our government employees find on their own, or in some cases have even purchased, for use basically as cyber weapons on a rainy day. And when do you disclose those back to vendors so those vulnerable software and programs can be patched and we're all more secure as a result, right? Really difficult balancing act with, personal privacy, security, autonomy, and national security, and in the balance there. And I give some kudos to the US that at least we're a little bit transparent in how we're doing that really difficult ethical balancing act. And if you're vendors like Microsoft, you want that to be really tilted one way with 100% disclosure. But there's a lot of necessary work and strategizing that needs to go around that core aspect of this, right? Because as we saw with, for example, the shadow brokers breach, when we do withhold those vulnerabilities and develop cyber weapons around them, and then that cash gets broken into and released on the dark web, I mean, that's helping to fuel this ransomware epidemic we've all been living with, right? So there's a clear responsibility there for governments, especially when they do, develop these weapons, to do everything possible to bring vendors along, to patch when necessary, and to safeguard those weapons once they are developed. So anyway, I took us in like 5 different directions. So I'm sorry about that. But great question.
So pulling on one of those threads, Clovia, what do you think? So you started to talk about the ways that we can incentivize responsibility within the system, and is one of the ways that you suggested was pushing towards more regulation, right? So I'd like to add a sort of question, and this is also building off of an audience question. So Eric asks, there's another trade-off between things like regulation and innovation, right? And so as you're thinking about incentivizing responsibility, are there other mechanisms that we can put in place to incentivize responsibility? And then to make the question even broader, to pull on another thread that both Mark and Scott brought up, is what type of mechanisms can we put in place? So anybody can answer this part. What type of mechanisms do we need to put in place to have multi-stakeholder approaches to both innovation, but then broadly cybersecurity as well, right? Because, or rather the other way, to cybersecurity and broadly to innovation, right? So that the people who are affected by decisions being made are in the room, right, when those decisions are being made. So again, 2 very, very broad questions. Take them in the direction you wish. Clovia, you first.
Okay. Well, I want to, touch on what Scott brought up about ransomware and tie it into what Mark mentioned in terms of looking at things as a social system. I think that's very important, that we not just look at regulations. I think the regulations need to be there, but we also need to, really look at the responsibilities of all the stakeholders, collectively. And to that end, one of the things that we do when we teach business law and ethics, is we spend quite a bit of time on, the whole point of those courses is to teach our students how to make ethical business decisions. So what we're talking about is decision making. One of the kind of a big ticket item tied to ransomware was this summer, President Biden spoke out about the Russian cyber attacks, and he made the statement that the United States has a right to defend itself. We can attack the Russian servers. That can be our response to this. So that's a decision that the United States could make, is that our response to this problem is to attack the Russian servers. So when these decisions get made, what to do about Facebook, what to do about the Russian cyber attacks, what to do about this problem and that problem, these are decisions, business decisions that have to be made. And so, I guess the idea that comes to mind in terms of textbook applications or approaches, which we don't hear much about in the news, of how these things are being played out in the real world. But I think we do need to go back to some of the textbook concepts of first and foremost, there are different lenses, different perspectives on how to make these ethical business decisions. And depending on what perspective the decision maker takes, it's going to have a lot to do with the decisions that get made. So where I'm going with this is, if we go back to, some of the fundamental teleology, deontology, should we look at just the consequences, or should we take a different lens and look at things relatively, be relativist, or should we look at things, what is the most utility we can get out of a situation, weigh benefits versus, harms and that sort of thing. So I think the perspectives, need to be kind of decided on by these individuals or groups that make decisions. And then that will dictate the approaches that get taken. And, and some perspectives may be better than others, it just depends on the circumstances. So, I would like to see these issues be handled in a more holistic way, and going back to some of our basic fundamental foundations of, what lens are we looking at out of, what perspectives should we take on, and then from there let that dictate the framework to approach these problems.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Mark?
Yeah, I guess I tend to struggle a little bit with the role of regulation, especially in terms of providing incentives. I think that can be a tremendously useful, productive approach, but it's such a delicate balancing act. So, and partly it's for the reasons I think that Clovia was indicating, is that you kind of have to decide on metrics when you're talking about regulation, because the regulations have to be clear, right? They have to be actionable. So because I'm a philosopher, I guess, I tend to look at these issues from a little bit more maybe qualitative stance. So to me, responsibility is a kind of virtue in the virtue ethics sense. And it's very closely tied, as all virtues are, to what we intend, what kind of effect we're striving to bring about. So if I'm an innovator, hopefully I have a vision for my innovation, for the effect that I want my innovation to have on my users, on society, on the other stakeholders. And of course, hopefully it's not just only to create a profit for myself. And whatever those goals are, whatever that vision is, well, that's going to then condition the kinds of virtues and the kinds of judgments that I make along the way. It's going to help order my priorities and help me make my choices. The thing about incentives is that they're kind of crude, right? They're rewards. There are stipulations. And the world being as complex as it is, innovation being as complex as it is, first of all, it can be tough to make those stipulations and those criteria relevant enough and specific enough to be productive. But the other catch is that it's difficult to create constraints that can't be fulfilled on paper while avoiding the real intent, right? So a matter with complying with the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. And to me, it's the spirit of the law that matters, right? It's the overall effect, it's the outcome, the intent. And so I absolutely think there's an essential role for regulation, but it's tricky, right? And another reason that it's tricky is that we're talking about a very fast moving space. So for the very same reason that a kind of retroactive role-based responsibility is a little bit of an obsolete concept today, especially in innovation, is the same kind of reason why regulation is a difficult thing to do. Because by the time a social process is enacted, or political or legal process is enacted, the technology may have moved on, right? It's a very dynamic space. So we have this well-known, well-recognized phenomenon of regulatory lag. And that's always going to be a challenge, I think. So now, I am not a policy expert. I don't really come at these issues from a policy perspective. And so that's maybe part of the reason why I don't have stronger feelings about the role of regulation. But I will say, of course, it can be an essential part of a response, part of a solution. But to me, at least from my perspective, the first and most essential response is ideally cultivating a culture in innovation spaces of responsibility. Of course, that's easier said than done as well. Maybe even harder.
Thank you so much. Scott, what do you think about the mechanism? So, you know, a lot of your work is focused on multi-stakeholder approaches to things like cybersecurity, right? Like what mechanisms can we put in place to, I mean, because, you know, I think it's well intentioned, right? Like, and it's good that we want everybody to be involved, but like, how do we actually make that happen? Like, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different tools at organizations' disposals. There's a new kind of a class of data stewards, which can be helpful, and those can be ways to bring consumers and kind of give them a voice. The EU, like Clovia mentioned as well, has this data protection officers that are now mandated under the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and that's another way to go about it. Organizations can, in other words, put forward a point person or group to help respond to these types of issues and to represent the voices of consumers in the boardroom. How much those voices are listened to, of course, is another matter. That gets us kind of dancing around the much bigger issue of human rights in this context, and the degree to which we should consider internet access itself, as well as frankly privacy and even cybersecurity as human rights, which should not short circuit these boardroom conversations or these policymaker conversations, but would definitely put a different glean on them, right? And again, reasonable people disagree about all of those, including Vince Cerf, right? He argues that internet access isn't a human right; it's just technology by which we exert other rights, including, as you said, Isak, freedom of expression earlier, freedom of assembly, etc. So, in my mind, and from the research that we've done on this, multi-stakeholder norm building efforts, there's certainly a growing contingent around the world of both, as civil society groups, companies, and now governments that are coming along, to this idea of, on the one hand, of course, privacy, being a human right that's more recognized by, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution a couple of years ago, the right to privacy in the digital age. Dozens of countries have signed up to that. Cybersecurity as a human right is not as well recognized, and it's interesting because and it's kind of lurking in the background of a lot of these discussions. Like a major multi-stakeholder initiative was the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace back in 2018. Happy to note that IU is the first university in the world to sign up to that. And among those principles that were listed, including things like election integrity, et cetera, was cyber hygiene and this kind of global culture of cybersecurity. So I mean, the notion is called out at a lot of those levels, but cybersecurity itself as a human right really isn't being discussed, and that could help elevate and potentially some of these conversations and the concerns, so that it's not just jurisdiction to jurisdiction, region to region, but that there's a framework in place that we can utilize in some of this decision making. So those are just a few thoughts off the cuff. I know time is short, and I am very sorry that Spaff couldn't join, because I'm sure he'd have something much more intelligent to say in response to that
exactly.
question.
Well, just sort of as a closing thought, and again, I echo those statements that I had about 5 questions here on the run of show for SPAF, so we'll have to hold a separate panel just so we can hear SPAF's views on this. That I think will be really important. But all the same, a question for all 3 of you is why do you think that ethics are, so you started, Scott, by talking about how you teach a little bit of ethics within your cybersecurity courses, but why has ethics in cybersecurity been sort of relegated to an afterthought?
It's a good question. And, in large part, for a long time, I think some of it's on us, right? We were kind of shrugging in the aftermath of a lot of these big breaches. And, we didn't stop purchasing health insurance from Anthem or shopping at Target or whatever the case may be as a result of their breaches. And in some cases, we just don't have the option. Look at Equifax, right? Which is a whole other set of issues. But there is something to be said for us not holding, these companies' feet to the fire. That's a collective action problem. It's just tough, right? And I think there's various ways to come at that we've discussed, whether it's empowering consumers, and groups like Consumer Reports are doing a lot to help, with rating systems for different products and services, so that we have some better idea about what the heck we're buying in terms of cybersecurity and privacy. And other jurisdictions, of course, including in the EU and Singapore, are further along with those kind of national and regional labeling laws that can help. And there's a variety of other, incentives that have been tried. We mentioned some along the way in this discussion, but, I think in part this has taken as long as it has because those conversations were pretty separate for quite some time. We were thinking about ethics, we were thinking about privacy, and we were thinking about cybersecurity. So that's why I think it's great that these are converging in a much more cohesive and meaningful way. And I'm glad it's happening in academia, and I think we need to do our part to make sure that it's also happening in boardrooms and policy circles too.
Thank you. Mark, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, you know what, I guess for my part, I have been really impressed, somewhat amazed, surprised by the resurgence of interest in ethics, in technology generally. I can say from personal experience, this is a rock that I was trying to push up the hill 10 years ago and getting nowhere, right? Just seeing it roll back down again, like Sisyphus. But I think we have passed an inflection point. I think 2016, I think the techlash, I think the disillusionment with social media have produced a fundamentally different perspective, relationship between technology and society, between Silicon Valley and the rest of the world. And I think that's a healthy thing in a lot of ways. I think the conversations that we are starting to have now, for example, here at Notre Dame, we started the Technology Ethics Center only 18 months ago, only about 2 years ago. And we are not the first, right? So I think we're witnessing a sort of renaissance, or I shouldn't say renaissance, a naissance of tech ethics, interest in relevance of technology ethics. Now, how that relates back to cybersecurity, it's sort of interesting to me because for a long time, I think discussions of cybersecurity were almost a role model for discussions of ethics in technology, because I think cybersecurity had gone through this period of being in the shadows as well, being considered less important, less critical, right? Let's get the product out there. Let's make sure it works. Let's innovate. Let's beat the competitors. Then maybe we'll worry about security. But long before ethics became part of the conversation, I think cybersecurity became part of routine development and business conversations. And so for a long time, at least looking at it from the ethics side, many of us looked to security as a kind of model. Like if we could embed consideration of ethics, the way that security had become embedded in design and development considerations, we would be ahead of the game, right? That would be progress. And I think now what we're seeing is those two worlds are sort of coming together, as Scott said. The discussions of privacy, the discussions of security, the discussions of ethics are merging. Because after all, at the end of the day, these are all different expressions of the social effect that the technology has, whether it's on our sense of autonomy, our sense of social well-being, or our sense of security. And so, kind of going back to my default idea that technology and innovation, they're really about the social creation, the social effect. I think that's why you're seeing these conversations start to happen and start to come together in what I take to be really productive, encouraging ways. So I'm encouraged by that, at least.
And of course,
there's a long way to go.
Someone in the audience, of course, pointed out, and I think this is a brilliant point, right? That, when we talk about pen testing and, of course, you can get EC Council certification and such things, we usually talk about it as ethical hacking, right? So, I think there certainly is movement in that direction, and has been for some time. So I think that's a brilliant point to whoever said that. Final word to you, Clovia, as we close.
Wow. I guess my final parting words is that ethics is difficult. I teach about 60 students a semester, and one of the exercises we do is we look at these different ethical lenses and perspectives. And I tell them, the reason we're doing it is because when you're in the real world, you're going to be faced with working with and engaging with people who have different perspectives than you. So, we have a classroom full of 60 students with different perspectives. Imagine how hard it is for, President Biden or for Zuckerberg or Colonial Pipelines CEO to make decisions, because you're grappling with a number of different perspectives in making these different decisions. So I think ethics becomes an afterthought because it's hard. It's hard, is very difficult to do or to discuss on a group level. And another thought I have is that, when we talk about engaging different stakeholders, we need to, as academics, do a better job of educating people on how to become more engaged, how to demand more from companies, how to demand more from governments. I don't think they know how, because first of all, they have to come to grips with their own lenses and perspectives on ethics. But then how do you parlay those thoughts and ideas to decision makers, on a larger scale? And so I think we need to figure out, how best to educate people on how to do that. So
thank you all so much. And thank you everyone for joining us here today. And what surely will be the first of many discussions, right? Scott, is there anything else to say about the community or anything, else that you'd like to sort of close with?
No, just that we hope, obviously, this is just the start of a dialogue here, and we hope to continue it. There's a lot that we need to engage with here and follow up on. As I mentioned in the chat there are a variety of working groups at the Ostrom Workshop here at IU that we'd love to help. And I know Notre Dame's Tech Ethics Center and, of course, Sirius at Purdue have had fantastic communities to engage with as well. So we hope to do just that. And thanks again for a terrific job moderating, Isak.
And thank you to everybody for organizing this,
Thank you,
everybody. We will look forward to seeing you again at the next event. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
thank you. Take care.